Peace. Salam. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. You're watching on Galaxy 19 satellite or Amazon Raku, Amazon Fire TV, Raku, and we're always there, muslimnetwork.tv, pretty soon on Apple TV as well, when about 7-8 different social media as well. When was the last time you went to bank? Many people don't go to bank now. Everything is electronic, and I think in 5 years in my personal banking, I have gone once to the bank, maybe 5, 6, 7 years. So while our money is there, we're depositing money, we're withdrawing money, we're writing checks, paying our bills. What is bank doing with our money? What is happening with that money? How bank makes money on our money? Are they making more money than we are making money on our money? What is going on here? And there is a whole lot there that we don't know, but some people are watching. And I have a guest today who has some strong words about bank, and I'll read those. Aggressively devising creative, non-transparent, and arguably extra-legal ways to transfer massive amounts of US taxpayer resources to wealthy stakeholders in zombie mega bank around the world is a dangerous, elitist strategy. Did you notice what he just said? Well, I read it twice. I'll repeat it for you. Let me repeat. Quote, aggressively devising creative, non-transparent, and arguably extra-legal ways to transfer massive amount of US taxpayer resources to wealthy stakeholders in zombie in zombie mega bank around the world is a dangerously elitist strategy. Please welcome Professor Ed Kane.
Hi.
Professor, welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm trying to center my face, and it isn't working out too well. It was fine before, but I don't know how to get more of me there. I guess that's it. Okay. Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it's hard to explain all those words without giving
we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. You're a professor, we're students, and we will learn from you through questions. Professor Ed Kane is a past president of American Finance Association. He has been professor at many places, including Boston College. He serves as the editorial boards of 7 professional journals. How do you find time to do all of that, Professor?
Well, right now, I'm not exactly a spring chicken, so I don't actually teach courses anymore. That gives me a lot more time.
All right. All right. So what is there a financial crisis in America? Because the stock market continues to go up. That's the arrow people watch.
Well, you can distinguish 2 kinds of crises, if you like, a financial crisis and an economic crisis. Now, we are in an economic crisis, but the Federal Reserve has been very agile in controlling the problems in the finance sector. They have put the bankers and the brokerage firms first, and they've done a great job at protecting those institutions. So if we get to the question, what I was talking about, taxpayer resources being transferred. Well, it is best to think of Federal Reserve as a central bank and owned by the taxpayers. And it is giving its resources out in a subsidized way to very troubled banks. Now, you used the term which I invented, zombie banks. Now, you understand, if you ever go into a zombie movie, that a zombie is a dead corpse that's been reanimated in some way by black magic. I mean, this is just a story. We're not really believing that there are zombies, but it nicely illustrates, the concept does, of how taxpayer support, which is what the government relies on, is its ability to collect taxes. The taxpayer support keeps banks going that have actually lost more in their assets than they owe on their liabilities. And when that happens, taxpayers become like stockholders, except they will never get a nickel of dividends. So that's how it gets transferred to the stockholders. Instead of making them take losses, the taxpayers stay on the hook for the losses and future losses until assets recover or the bank has been able to earn back the losses.
So, Professor, what's the difference between a normal bank and a zombie bank?
What was the first kind of bank? A solvent bank. Yeah, a solvent bank has assets that are worth more than its liabilities. So the taxpayers have, if they were to liquidate the bank at fair prices, will get a return from the liquidation. When an institution is insolvent, if you sell its assets, it can't cover its debts. But because we have government guarantees, and the government guarantees are really of two types. One is explicit guarantees up to a certain amount, like $250,000. But the implicit are, for very large banks, limitless. That is, they're not going to close Chase or Bank of America or even Wells Fargo because they're afraid to do that and afraid to make the stockholders bear the losses that would be entailed. They're afraid of what is called a panic. So we have all sorts of restrictions to make sure that stockholders do have a stake that apply in ordinary times. But when the economy goes into crisis or threatens to go into crisis, then they don't enforce those requirements. And in fact, they make it very clear that they will allow people to be a little creative in how they value the loans that are behind in payment or can be seen to not be serviced in the next few months.
Tell me, what in your view is a good bank?
Well, good from whose point of view, right? That the very biggest banks in this country, like Chase Manhattan or JP Chase, Morgan Chase is what the name it goes on now. That gets the point across about how many different identity changes or name changes, at least, the bank is going through. That's probably the best managed big bank. But the main point that makes them good investments for stockholders is the protection on the downside of the taxpayer riding to the rescue, because they will not enforce the idea that they have positive stockholder capital in these banks. They rely on the government's willingness to help them hide losses and keep them going.
So how does the bank work? I mean, we deposit our money, we take it out. Probably 99% of Americans just use bank as a place to keep money. What do they do with our money?
Well, they put it to work in various ways. In many cases, in the last couple of decades, very creative ways, new types of instruments. And the main idea is for them to earn more money on the funds you and other depositors supply than it costs them to service the accounts and to pay some explicit interest on the money. So you have two kinds of return on your deposits. One is a numerical return, like might be 1% or half of 1% or a third of 1%. That's paid in the coin of the realm. But the main return for most of us is the services. That is, that if we write a check, they see that the funds go to the person we write the check to. If we have extra money in our account, they're protecting it. We're not going to be held up on the street and robbed, or in our homes robbed to get this currency. It's safe, and they have substantial security, which you can see, and they're happy to explain it to you if you want. And so that's a real service, because you walk around with money, you're asking for trouble in many parts of this country. And of course, they have credit card services in most cases. Those are, rollover loans, but they're very profitable. People that don't pay on time may have to pay 18% on the overage or the underpayment. And, that's pretty good when the market interest rates are running in something between 0 and 1%.
So if you want to start a bank, which is more responsive to the community or the neighbors, what they should do? I mean, can bank be beneficial to the communities where they are sitting?
Of course they can, and many banks are. That we're talking about the very biggest banks as the ones that become zombies. There really is at least a 2-tier or maybe 3-tier system, where the smaller banks are held to tougher standards than the big banks. And this has a lot to do with politics as well as economics. But in any case, the entry into banking is closely controlled. If you wanted to walk out of the studio and form a bank, you would meet a formidable array of legal documents that you had to pass and other kinds of tests of your character. And you would have to have some real money to put into the bank. And so entry is limited. And in this industry, both entry and exit are limited. So you can't just jump in to make some money because other people are making money in banking. You will have to pass all these tests and jump all these hurdles. And as far as getting out, that's the question of the examiners declaring you insolvent. And so let's get back to the question, why is it hard to get rid of a very large bank? Did it close it down and recapitalize it? And you could, in principle, reopen it again and just force losses on the stockholders and on the creditors who weren't fully explicitly insured federally. This could be done, but it'd be very messy. And whenever, in the last crisis, the FDIC took over a couple of fairly big institutions, but not giant ones, not any of the top 10, say. But it was quite a lot of work, and they had to put some of their best people, a number of their best people, into those banks, which left them short of people to put into other bigger banks that may have also needed to be taken over in taxpayers' interest. But it's not it's very hard to step into the shoes of another institution, a big institution, a very complex institution. So they try to work it out. That is, the officials try to work it out, put some people in the bank, perhaps constrain them in their behavior as best they can. But by and large, those banks will be gambling for resurrection, gambling that some of their positions will gain value and restore them to solvency. And so far in this century, that's worked out very well for the biggest banks. The biggest banks gained substantial amounts of market share over the rest of the industry during the last crisis. And that is because they are seen to be safer, and because they are also the ones who absorb the banks that are closed, or at least disproportionately absorb them. They may not absorb them all, but they absorb enough and they look safer, so they grow. Crises are very, very good for big banks.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Ed Kane. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. You're watching us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, as well as many social media, and pretty soon on Apple TV as well. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Ed Kane. Professor, there used to be something called credit unions. How they're different from the banks?
Well, first, there still are credit unions, thousands of credit unions. They can be chartered by the federal government, again, like banks can, or by the state, again, like banks can. Credit unions come out of a different tradition. You have to go back to the 19th century to understand the tradition. But the banks were not welcoming to ordinary people, especially immigrants, during the 19th century, the early 19th century. So many of them got together in a group to pool their money and lend some of it to others, to other members. So the whole idea is you're a member of a credit union. You're not a stockholder, you're not just a depositor, you're a member. And so they developed their own charter, what things they could do. Say the main thing, last time I looked, that they did was they tended to provide automobile loans at a better interest rate than banks. That is, they only provide them to the members, and the members had to meet certain conditions. In many cases, it was a question. Originally, it would be, say, a bunch of people from the same country, like Italians or Irish or Germans, that were in a community and in those times being discriminated against. And so it was a self-help organization, and it has evolved, and it has its own federal regulator, its own state regulators, and it is a good place to get automobile loans and sometimes mortgages as well for members. Initially, when it became the mortgage loan, it couldn't make mortgage loans to all the members that might want them. So they had to do other things to ration that. But that it's just the credit union is just a response to the difficulties of what was the class system, and for individuals to get it right.
So is it a fading phenomena, or are there people still moving and benefiting from that credit union system?
Oh, yes. First, there are occupational credit unions, often at an individual company. The employees will have a credit union office set up, and they will both deposit monies and take out various kinds of loans. They're in the same building that they work. There's been a great broadening of the customer base. That there's a lot of legal changes that made it possible for all of us really to find a credit union. And the credit unions advertise on TV here in Arizona, for instance. They sponsor, they have a very clever campaign, the main one, using coaches from the University of Arizona teams to sell the idea that, you know, they're taking care of ordinary people in a very good way. But it is not really much of a growth industry today, although you know, the banks are aware of this opportunity and compete against it more effectively. But these institutions are federally insured and inspected, and there is a sense of belonging that you'll never get in a bank.
So would you encourage communities to look more towards the credit union type of models?
Maybe communities, but not individuals. That a community, a real community with lots of common values and caring about each other would do very well in the credit union model. But if people are basically individuals trying to make out best for their family, they probably would be happier in a bank. So if you travel a lot, for instance,
Go ahead.
You'll be able to cash checks on JP Morgan Chase without any trouble anywhere in the world. But if you have some local credit union, just all I can say is, will you be able to use an ATM in a foreign country or even in a different state? Will they have a network established? How far will that network go? But you know that the very biggest banks are everywhere. So, and it'd be much easier to cash a check when everybody knows the institution exists, and your check might not have been printed overnight in your basement.
So tell us, what is the DoddFrank bill?
Well, of course, it's an act now. A bill is what you call it until it's been passed and signed by the president. This was basically the response to what we call the Great Financial Crisis. That is the crisis of 2007 to 2009. And it took several years to put it together. And Barney Frank, who's the second name there, had the most to do with putting it together. And how it was put together has been described in a book called An Act of Congress. And it explains how Mr. Frank went to various trade groups and traded off all these concerns. That is, they would get some benefits and some restrictions that were new. And the centerpiece of it all was the idea of tougher capital requirements. That is, tougher requirements to have a positive stake in the institutions. That is, you could call these anti-zombie rules. But when a big problem hits the banking industry, that they are still on a proper understanding of what leverage means, very likely, at least the biggest banks, to become what they might acknowledge as temporarily insolvent. And the government, so the government tends to suspend in subtle ways the very improvements, the capital requirements that the Act set up. That is, there are stories where they explain that they're not going to be as tough, especially in Europe, be as tough on these capital requirements and the accounting. It all depends on what is called a loss and when it's recognized. And in tough times, regulators don't make the biggest institutions recognize what we would call, as economists, opportunity cost losses. That is, if you had to sell your assets, you could not get the price in which you're carrying them. You would get much less.
So tell us about how zombie banks continue to suck money from the public treasury. Do they do that through their lobbying effort? What is banking lobby?
Well, those are two very different questions. So let me back up and start with the first one. They don't actually suck money. They suck anything guarantee. So if you are insolvent, the incentives are, with limited liability, to go for broke. You try to take new risks, and risks that are sufficient to restore your solvency if your ship comes in, as if you win these bets. And the biggest banks in the US during the last crisis did very well, and they gained market share, and they can be contrasted with Europe, which still has a lot of zombie banks, didn't make them recover, and are very, I say, very reliant on the promise of Federal Reserve support if they should have a run. You understand what a run is when the depositors try to get all their money at one time, and the bank would have to sell some assets in adverse circumstances at such times. So runs are regarded as very destructive and dangerous, and authorities try to stop them. Now, so your other question was what? What is it? What was your second question? Lobby. Well, you understand where the word comes from, that ordinarily only members of a legislature are allowed onto the floor of the legislature. So if we're talking about the Senate or the House of the United States, you can't have a representative of a troubled bank, say, or a bank that wants to change the law, onto the floor. So the idea is they meet the legislators in the lobby and then tell them what they think they should do and why. So a lobbyist is really a person carrying information from some part of the industry to the legislators, and by extension to, say, the president and his cabinet and so on. So lobbyists perform a function of explaining things that the legislators may not understand. You want to realize that most of the members of Congress are lawyers by profession. And there'll be some fine economic points that they probably won't understand. Now, so lobbyists will explain these points. But
so they hire lobbyists? Are there big lobbyist banks hire? Do those firms do their dirty job, or they use grassroots lobbying? How do they influence lawmakers to favor them?
First, I mean, as you say, there are also grassroots lobbyists we talk about, people that are trying to represent what they think is the public interest. And then you have industry lobbyists who are representing especially the views of the industry. Of course, they want the industry to survive, so they shouldn't try to scalp everyone in short order. They should try to spread this out over time. But you'll have the people from consumer groups and other public interest groups trying to influence whatever legislation is being considered by either a committee or the entire legislative body. By the time it gets to the legislative body for an up or down, the lobbyists have usually done their work. Now, you talked about if you like, dirty lobbying and clean lobbying. You can have a lobbyist to tell people straight what they need to know, and it helps their work if they can be trustworthy. And the really dirty ones use tricks to create an economic interest in the way the bill comes out. There was a story just, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, before the crisis, of a congressman and his wife, who was some kind of administrator in the government, selling all their stock ahead of the COVID crisis. And that's still under investigation.
Yes.
But you can be sure that it was some lobbyist that convinced them that, on an honest basis, that there were troubles coming. Now, what's ironic is that their stock is probably already recovered, because the stock market is doing very well, because that's been the number one concern of the government. I mean, right now, the bill to provide additional benefits to unemployed people is hung up between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats want it, and the Republicans don't want to pay it. The Republicans are basically the party of the well-off and the whites, and the Democrats have a much more diverse political base.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ed Kane. You have been very helpful in understanding the Banking 101 and your trademark zombie banks and what they do. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Sumaya Heather, for producing today's show. Aliza Majid, our intern producer. You're watching Galaxy 19 satellite and Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and a whole lot of social media. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. Stay tuned for more programs. Peace. Salam.
Shalom.